before Francine's eyes. "You know how he is, Francie. He can be so charming. I loved him as the man of God he seemed to be, and then I simply loved him. It was like I couldn't help myself." "I don't believe you, and neither will anyone else. I don't know what you think you're going to get out of this." Tony turned back to her. "I need a friend, Francie. I need someone to hear me out, be on my side. He wants me to have an abortion. He said he'll deny anything ever happened between us." "I can't help you, Tony. I won't be a party to whatever game it is you're playing." "But you're all I have," Tony pleaded. "I can't go back home now. This would kill George and Mama. I have nowhere else to turn." Francine inhaled deeply. "Not this time, Tony. Not this time. I've stood by you through a lot of your drama, most of it of your own making, but not this time. This time you're on your own." Tony opened her mouth as if to defend herself, but then she shook her head. "What does it matter?" she said, the defeat in her voice wrenching Francine's heart. As Francine watched, Tony turned her petite frame away and headed off, shoulders slumped, toward her bedroom. Francine closed her eyes and issued a brief prayer on Tony's behalf. She didn't know what had gotten into Tony, but she prayed her friend would soon see the error of her ways and repent. Francine loved her, but she couldn't support her, not this time. She and Tony had grown up together, been friends for as long as Francine could remember, but Francine had to face facts. Tony wasn't ready to give her life to the Lord, and Francine couldn't be held back because of it. She heaved a deep sigh, knowing that even though it hurt, she had done the right thing. She could have ignored Tony's actions, but that would not have been love. She knew from Psalms that the harsh truth from a friend was better than sweet words from an enemy. As she reached for the phone to call Cassandra, her friend and prayer partner, to tell her about the conversation with Tony, Francine heard what sounded like the backfire of a car, followed by a loud thump, both coming from the direction of Tony's room. Wondering what Tony was doing to make such noise, Francine forgot the phone and headed for her friend's room. When she got no answer to her knock, she turned the doorknob. She screamed as she realized the sound she'd heard hadn't been the backfire of a car at all. Chapter 1. 3 months later. Francine Amen straightened her shoulders and exhaled a deep breath as she walked from her room on the patient wing of the Southwest Ohio Mental Health Clinic through the patient activity ward on her way to her morning appointment with Dr. Jennings, her therapist of record for the last 85 days. As she made her way across the breezeway, she gave slight nods of greeting to the patients and nurses much too familiar to her. The stale odor of despair mingled with the fresh but antiseptic smell of Lysol that characterized the patient area contrasted greatly with the cinnamon aroma that greeted her when she passed through the glass double doors that served as the boundary between the mentally unwell and those who treated them. Sometimes the casual elegance of the lobby outside the staff offices, potted plants, rich artwork on the walls, deep-cushioned chairs and settees in bright multicolored patterns, was almost enough to make her forget where she was and why she was there. Almost, but not quite. Straightening her back even more, Francine strode toward the sign-in desk with one thought on her mind. In 3 days, she would leave this place that had become an unlikely home and refuge for her. "Morning, Francine," the duty nurse, Margaret, a grandmotherly woman of about 60, said to her. "Dr. Jennings hasn't gotten here yet, but we're expecting her any minute now. You can go on into her office." Thanks, Margaret. How are you this morning? Busy, but good. I hear you're leaving us on Sunday. You know, I'm happy to see you go, but we sure are going to miss you around here. Francine smiled. Believe it or not, I'm going to miss you too, but that doesn't mean I want to stay any longer. The older woman chuckled. I know what you mean. Now you go on into the doctor's office. I have to run some papers over to the patient wing. Dr. Jennings will probably beat me back here. Francine followed the older woman's directive and went into the doctor's office to wait. As she took her seat on the couch, she remembered her first visit to this office. Then, she'd wondered if she was supposed to stretch out on the couch. She smiled at her ignorance. Before her stay here, her knowledge of therapists had been limited to what she knew from primetime television. Fortunately for her, Dr. Jennings was neither Fraser Crane nor Bob Hartley. Francine looked toward the door as it opened, and the bubbly Dr. Jennings stormed in. Sorry I'm late, the 5-foot red-headed dynamo said. Then, without preamble, she took a seat in the chair across from Francine and said, So you're going home Sunday? Home, Francine thought. Back to Georgia, a place she hadn't visited in the last 5 years. This hospital was more familiar to her than home was. That's what they tell me. So how do you feel about it? Dr. Jennings glanced down at the yellow legal pad that seemed to always be on her lap, a habit Francine found unnerving. It was as if the woman couldn't remember Francine's issues and had to check the pad to remind herself. How do I feel about it? Francine thought to herself. She was ready to leave, but ready to leave wasn't a feeling. She'd been in therapy long enough to understand the difference between feelings and thoughts. I'm a bit anxious, she said, glancing down at her recently manicured hands, courtesy of the hospital services staff. But I guess that's to be expected. Why anxious? Francine shrugged her shoulders and glanced out the plate glass windows overlooking the recently mowed north lawn of the institution. Why shouldn't I be anxious? I'm a 33-year-old woman running home to her sister after being let loose from the funny farm. I think that's enough to be anxious about. When the doctor didn't respond, Francine turned to her. What? No more questions? Dr. Jennings looked down at her pad again. This is your time, Francine. If you want to spend it making sarcastic remarks, go right ahead. Francine turned the corners of her lips down and sank back into the couch. She rubbed her hands on her jean-clad thighs. Okay, you're right. Sorry. Don't be sorry, Dr. Jennings said. Recognize what you're doing. Francine knew Dr. Jennings was referring to the way she used sarcasm to handle emotions and situations that made her uneasy. I'm anxious about going back home. I don't look forward to living with my sister. I don't look forward to seeing the people that I was so ugly to before I left. I dread seeing Tony's family. Dr. Jennings leaned forward in full empathy mode. I know that'll be hard for you, seeing Tony's family again. Hard was a mild way to describe what Francine felt about seeing Tony's mother and brother again. The last time she'd seen them was when they'd come to Dayton to get Tony's body. They'd come to her wanting answers about what led their daughter and sister to suicide. By then, Francine had learned that Tony had indeed been pregnant, and the reaction of her friend Cassandra to the news had pretty much convinced her that Tony hadn't been lying about Bishop Payne being the father. Tony's family had been devastated after they dragged those gory details out of Francine. Out of their devastation had come their accusations. Francine, who had already tried and convicted herself, accepted their condemnation without a word of self-defense. The last thing she remembered